maximum number of hours for early voting since we authorized it 30 years ago. Proponents of the bill will argue this change is not problematic, that it reduces the number of early voting hours in only 4 counties. Yet, approximately 1 of 3 Black Texans, 1 of 3 Latino Texans, and 1 of 3 Asian Texans live in 1 of those 4 counties. Irrespective of the motives of the bill's author or the members who vote for it, if Senate Bill 1 is passed, it will result in communities of color having fewer opportunities to vote. We should instead be taking action to make it easier for all Texans to have a voice in our political process. If we truly want to make it easier to vote, we could join the 40 other states that allow online voter registration. Although Texas allows online voter registration when driver's licenses are renewed online, that was not achieved through legislation, but rather mandated by a court order. If we truly want to make it easier to vote, we should make voter registration automatic when eligible voters renew their driver's license or change their addresses. If we truly want to make it easier to vote, we should make Election Day a state holiday. These are only a few of the actions we could take if we truly wanted to make it easier to vote. This bill would not. Instead, Senate Bill 1 would outlaw drive-through voting, making it harder to vote by mail by creating new requirements, and restrict the distribution of mail-in ballot applications. It's not a mistake that many of these provisions are aimed at Harris County, our biggest and most diverse county in the state. Persons of color voted in record numbers in Harris County in 2020, and they have become a target of this legislation. And the make it harder to cheat part? No one has shown that there is widespread fraud or widespread cheating in Texas elections. The Attorney General's representative said earlier this year there were 44 voting fraud cases pending of 11.2 million votes cast in Texas in 2020. Witness Julie Oliver testified before the State Affairs Committee. Since 2004, there have been 839 complaints of fraud in Texas, of more than 100 million votes cast. The rushed way this bill moved through the process during the special session also was disappointing. Alex Cogan of the ARC of Texas told our State Affairs Committee that persons with disabilities were shut out of the process because of insufficient notice and not allowing virtual testimony during this COVID surge. People with disabilities deserve a place at the table, she said, noting that Senate Bill 1 will have a detrimental effect on their voting rights. Thankfully, some of their suggestions were included in this bill, thanks to Senator Hughes. During the hearings, 360 of 475 witnesses said this bill would make it harder to vote and not necessarily harder to cheat. For these and other reasons, I will respectfully vote no on Senate Bill 1. Thank you, Mr. President and members.
Senator West, what purpose?
To speak against the bill.
You're recognized.
You know, members, I'm not going to be long. What I've had to say, I've already said. I must admit I was disappointed. I've been trying to find middle ground on these types of issues, and I want to try to make certain that Texas leads the way for the rest of the country to find middle ground. I've recommended doing a disparity study. Hopefully you will have your staffs to look at that. Many of us have talked about the suppressive nature of this bill. Let me be very clear. This bill is not a final bill until we get back the Conference Committee report. And assuming that the House makes changes and a Conference Committee report is issued, that will be the final bill and the final story about whether there are suppressive aspects of this bill or not. So the question becomes, yes, we've had our colleagues being in Washington, D.C., urging Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Think back in history. When did people of color get voting rights? It wasn't as a result of the states. It was a Texan by the name of LBJ that signed legislation that frankly allowed me to be here to make this argument today. It wasn't a state legislature. It had to be done at the federal level. Yes, House members and some of us went up to Washington, D.C. to encourage Washington to do its job while doing our job to encourage them to do their job. Frankly, no other alternatives. Given the conference committee report, Mr. President, that was presented to this body to vote on during the regular session. So what alternatives did we as legislators have, knowing the history of civil rights in this country? We had to do everything in our power to make certain that Washington, D.C. did their job. And they still hadn't done it yet. But that was pretty much our alternative. But Texas can still lead. If we decide to look at the issue of disparity studies, what it is, as it goes, this bill goes through the legislative process, and before we cast the final vote on it. We have the ability to do it. The question is whether or not we have the willingness to do it. I would hope that you would take into consideration the history of civil rights legislation in this country and voting rights legislations in this country. Decide to not vote. Well, let me back up. You may want to vote for this particular bill, but not make your final decision to support this bill until we actually see whether or not what the conference committee report will look like when it comes back, knowing the history of this country and also knowing the history of the state.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lucio, you're speaking on the bill, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, the right to vote is sacred. I heard that from my dad, and I want to dedicate just a few words in memory of my father, who wanted to make sure all his 10 children never missed an election. It is the cornerstone of our democracy, and it is, in fact, the reason why we are all here on this floor today. As Texas senators, we are given one of the greatest privileges, the opportunity to represent the people that voted, and I repeat, voted for us to be here. Every single person that voted for us entrusted us with their livelihoods and demand from us that we put their interests first. Chairman Hughes, I know that you and I both agree that our right to vote is very sacred. You have said it in debate, in hearings, and on this floor. I believe you when you say that. I truly do. I also believe that even though we can all agree that the right to vote is sacred, our country has not always afforded the sacred right to all. As Senator West reminded us moments ago, as a country that prides itself on its democracy, it has had to pass legislation over and over to enfranchise new groups of people. Each time it does so, we are recognizing time and time again that the right to vote is not only important, but it enshrines this sacred right that we refer to. As a sacred right, every person who is eligible to vote should have the same ease of access to the voting booths as they do when they speak their mind freely or go to church and worship. Again, Senator West mentioned earlier today that we have the technology to make voting easier. We can and we should do this. I believe that every person who's eligible to vote should have access to vote, and only those eligible to vote should vote. I, like every one of you on this floor, am against fraud. Any kind of fraud, especially fraud in voting. I do not want fraud, nor does any person on this floor, again, but certain measures that are put in place that make it harder to access the voting booth doesn't necessarily eliminate fraud. But what it surely does is limit the ability of the people, our voters, to decide for themselves how government should work for them, and whether we are truly the ones chosen by those who make the attempt to vote is the mark of a true democracy. Provisions that potentially impact racial minorities should be looked at closely, and provisions that affect the ease of access to the polls by people with disabilities should be given the strictest of scrutiny. Our constituents are worth fighting for, and their sacred right to vote is truly worth defending. 31 of us have been chosen by the voters to be here today. 31 of us represent 29.2 million people. Let this sink in. Let's continue to ensure that government works for all of them and for all the future generations that will be called Texans in the future ahead of us. Let's be one Texas family, one for all and all for one. Thank you, Mr. President and members.
Thank you, Senator Lucio. Senator Johnson, what purpose?
To speak on the bill.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, enough has been said over the past several months about the lack of evidence of fraud here. I know many of you sincerely think that these measures are necessary to combat some future fraud, but I'm not convinced this bill is about election security. I think we have very secure elections that's been testified to. If we want to enact a few things here and there to tighten things up, I'm all for it. We can have a little better discussion about it, but this bill is vastly different than anything that could legitimately be described as an election security bill. I heard in a silly kind of puerile video recently that it's a bill about expanding early voting hours. That's what it's about. I mean, nobody really thinks that's what this bill is about. What is it about? It's about division, and it's about winning. Division, by that I mean propelling a narrative that riles up a base, that makes people angry at each other, like these other bills we talked about, like the critical race theory bill, mistrust between Republicans and Democrats. We've got enough of that going on right now. It's a very sensitive time. We shouldn't be pushing this kind of bill in the absence of any real reason to push it. What am I talking about specifically? Criminal penalties, civil penalties against the election workers who we trust, who have served our state election after election after election, Republicans and Democrats, who are not committing fraud, and yet we've got all sorts of enhanced criminal penalties for the fraud they're not committing, sending some sort of message, while we're enabling poll observers to go places and do things they've never been able to do before. Maybe some of it's okay, but right now, in all the fervor that we have, is that the right thing for us to be doing? And to enact these criminal and civil penalties against our reliable election workers, but notice there's no civil or criminal penalties for observers who go there to harass and alter the outcome. They're free, or they get kicked out after maybe 2 tries. Sending the wrong message there, that's divisive. The other component of this is about winning. Notice that the provisions of this bill tend generally to combat trends that would favor Democrats. And if we're going to have elections with integrity, they should be neutral. Let's take a look at something that everyone would think is not about favoring one party over another. Mail-in ballots. In fact, statistically, if you run through it, those tended to go a little bit more Republican. Right now, it's pretty close to even. But what's important is if you look at the trend line, look at what has happened to the partisan readings on mail-in ballots over the past several cycles.